everybody, Dana here again, and welcome back to Tuesday Tips for Leaders of Volunteers. And we're continuing with part 2 of the safety of youth volunteering and youth volunteer programs, and just kind of working with kids and families and even different ages of other potentially vulnerable populations like elders. So in part 1, we covered working with different age groups and kind of what kind of tasks or supervision is appropriate for the age of the kid, both grade school through 17, not quite an adult yet. And we also talked about setting up some, kind of specific policies that are really clear to the parents or your adult volunteers or adult paid staff members of who's in charge of supervising the kids and how that can be doled out in a very fair way. So that's part of what we covered in part 1, and take a look at that. But this also serves as its own standalone video, or you can watch these together as a complete series. It's up to you. I am not an attorney. This is not official legal advice, but I'm setting these Tuesday tips up as really general guidelines that have worked for me when I have created youth volunteer opportunities in agencies that have never had them before, when I've advised on youth programs, reaching out to the public and working with kids and families or elders or homebound. And these are things that I know have worked across nonprofits and government agencies. But your mileage may vary, so check with your internal legal team for your organization, or if you don't have a legal team or an attorney within your organization, then there are usually a lot of other nonprofits that you can partner with that have templates and models of policies that are appropriate to your state or part of the world. So with that out of the way, let's jump right back into part 2. Everyone's always worried about stranger danger. We touched upon that a little bit in part 1. But statistically, kids are unfortunately more likely to be harmed or abused emotionally or physically by people that they already know and trust, friends, family, or people that they're already working closely together with a community group. So keeping that statistic in mind, I'm bringing that up because it's important to know and to not just make an assumption or have your own bias about who's out to harm kids. We want to let go of all of that. We want to not buy into any kind of hateful rhetoric or shifting changes in opinions about different groups, and understand that when we're working with kids and families, that their own dynamics in their own family, with their guardians, with their peers, if they're with the school, that's something to keep an eye on for bullying or isolation or verbal abuse or anything like that occurring. But I'm bringing that up because that relates to whether or not your paid staff are considered mandated reporters. So in California, where I've primarily operated, paid staff members, particularly of government agencies, are considered mandated reporters. They have a legal obligation to report neglect, harm, or abuse when it's suspected and when certain signs of it occur. And there's a certification and a training that is provided by the state on an online course to get that certification. It takes a certain number of hours. That may vary by where you are. If you're in the United States, it will absolutely vary by whether you're in Canada or around the world. But kind of check with those local laws and certification programs, because if your paid staff are going through that, even though you're volunteers, most of the time in the US and in California, volunteers are not legally mandated reporters. If they suspect something, they don't have a legal obligation to talk to the police or other people who may be able to help, like social services. So that's a really important distinction for volunteers and paid staff members to understand when they join your agency, or if you're updating your training or adding youth volunteers, working with youth volunteers, or you're adding, starting to work with minors or kids or families or vulnerable populations. So be really clear yourself and help draft out that policy and how you're describing volunteer or staff recruitment roles that delineate whether or not they're going to get that kind of training on mandated reporter and they're going to be legally obligated to it. Or in my case, I had volunteers go through the certification and the agency paid for it just so that they had the knowledge, even though they didn't have the legal pressure to do it. It was really helpful to round out all of their learning about working with kids and families. The other big thing that we talk about as a topic with youth volunteers is background checks. And this has its own number of biases and barriers attached to just the idea of background checks. I absolutely recommend that if you're working with minors, people under the age of 18, that whoever's working with them who is an adult has a background check, and that the background checks for adult volunteers working with youth and adult paid staff working with youth are the same. There isn't a difference if their supervisory roles or programmatic tasks of working with kids are pretty close to the same. They should have the same level of background check. Where this can be a barrier to people is if we think about the 3 C's of comfort, convenience, connection. Background checks hit convenience because it takes time and it takes money to do a background check, and the cost can vary, but you can use a service like Sterling Volunteers or similar type of thing to help screen volunteers for you ahead of time, or you can have volunteers have the onus be on them to make an appointment and go and get live scanned or fingerprinted and go through the FBI or Department of Justice in your local jurisdiction and go through that whole process and pay for it themselves. But whatever your process is, if you can make it as clear as possible and set and meet expectations of what is the volunteer paying for or having to do for their background check, or what are they having to provide as far as, privacy concerns and their contact information or social security number, and what is the agency's responsibility of their confidentiality, their privacy, and also very clearly define in background checks for, again, paid or unpaid team members who are adults working with minors, what you're looking for in the background check. And typically, privacy laws mean that only one person, it may not even be the volunteer coordinator or director of volunteer services, but typically one person is allowed to see the results of the background check, and they just go thumbs up or thumbs down on that person based on a written policy of what you've agreed upon with as a leader of volunteers and volunteer services in your role of, we want to screen out domestic violence, animal abuse, hardcore property damage, arson, things like that, any kind of violence, but we don't care about parking tickets or even potentially past DUIs or drug possession charges if someone isn't, driving for you, and if you're not specifically running like a clean and sober program. That can impact depending on the type of work that you're doing with your agency. Your agency may specifically want to reach out to formerly incarcerated people to give them a second chance. And so just make it really clear what you're looking for in a background check, what will eliminate someone from being able to work with your agency, and what you're not as worried about for the specifics of the role that they are applying for, again, paid or unpaid. Now, there's also a lot of bias, racial bias in our justice system. So I want to talk about not letting biases about groups of people, either by background or gender or sexual orientation, don't let biases or bigotry or an uptick in hateful rhetoric against a certain group help you make your decision, because what really counts are the statistics and the specifics of the role, how they're working with kids and families or vulnerable populations, and again, making it fair to the paid staff and the volunteer adults working with kids, that that's an equitable, same system for the same types of jobs. The parents of the kids have a role to play in all of this as well, and the parents can be pains in your butt to kind of be helicopter parents and hovering too much, or they can be on the other side of the scale where they're not engaged enough with what's going on with their kids. And again, this may or may not be related to things we look for as mandated reporters, but that should also be part of a written policy of how involved are the parents in their kids volunteering? Like, are they filling out applications for them and answering questions for them when you really want to hear from the teenager themselves so that you know they can communicate? Or the other end of the spectrum, are parents coming to a creek park cleanup and kids are picking up litter with litter getters and the parents are just standing there on their phones not keeping an eye on a kid falling into a creek? So again, just make it really clear to set and meet the expectations for the parents or the guardians or the teachers or the community service group leaders that are bringing a group of volunteers that might include kids or youth in it. And also, what is the response from your volunteers, your agency's volunteers supervising families or youth, and the same with paid staff. So there should be a written policy of, if there's an incident or if there's a complaint, these are the exact ways and steps that we take and actions we take to handle it, to investigate, to protect everybody's privacy, confidentiality. We have to be especially careful of that with youth volunteers or youth in general. But again, having that written policy of, this is how we respond to a complaint, this is how we respond if we witness, a parent slapping a kid or an older kid bullying them if they're both minors. Having all of that designed ahead of time as, again, just an equitable and fair response policy is super important. I have done a lot of work with agencies that their primary mission is, teaching kids about nature or science, or they are doing after-school programs and things. And for some odd reason, these groups had been able to just go without really any written policies or background checks, and it had just never occurred to them. Maybe they had grown from a couple of people just, doing an informal group and then later developed into a nonprofit. But there's just a lot of, it's just very, very common that there's not quite a full range of policies, including responses and setting and meeting expectations. So this is why I decided to make this series, is to help you plan for that or update your programs, or if you're starting from scratch, at least knowing a few things on a checklist to start from. So there's so many rewards to working with youth, to giving them great memories and experiences, possibly getting them interested in a career path, or at least having that empathy and that connection to community service, that I always think that the rewards of doing this far, far outweigh the risks. And it just takes a little bit of work to set up youth volunteers or youth working with youth programs in the community. Setting up these programs and policies does take some mindfulness, it takes some detail, it takes a little bit of work up front, and it is absolutely worth it and a big payoff for so many people's lives being changed for the better and doing good work with your agency. So I really hope you've enjoyed this two-part Tuesday tips on the safety of youth volunteer programs, and we'll see you next time.